Hi, I'm Alyssa Johnson, and in this presentation, we are going to talk about plagiarism and citations as part of your scientific writing review. So as defined by the Council of Writing Program Administrators, plagiarism occurs when a writer deliberately uses someone else's language, ideas, or other original, non-common knowledge material without acknowledging its source. So as an example, this would be using another person's text as your own, or not distinguishing clearly between the ideas and words of another and your own ideas and words. Some of the challenges in scientific writing are that you are tasked with developing a topic based on what has already been said and written, but you have to write something that's new and original, and this itself is a conflict. You have to rely on the opinions of experts and authorities on a topic, but somehow improve upon and or disagree with those same opinions. You have to give credit to researchers who have come before you, but at the same time, make your own significant contribution. And you have to improve your English or fit into a discourse of community by building upon what you hear and read, but at the same time, use your own words and your own voice. So it's well recognized that this poses quite a challenge when writing something such as the background or your protocol or a paper. Turnitin, which is a well-known software available to academic institutions to assess for plagiarism in academic pieces such as papers and term papers, put together a really nice review of the top types of plagiarism across the country. They did a survey and they found that the top types of research, or plagiarism, were what they termed the clone, which is both frequent, as you can see in this graph, as well as problematic. The clone is when someone submits another's work word for word as one's own. They also used fun terms to describe each of these types of plagiarism, such as Control-C, which basically represents when someone would use Control Copy on a computer, where a paper contains significant portions of text from a single source without altering it. So you just copy and paste that into a paper. They also found that the find and replace type of plagiarism, where a person changes keywords and phrases but retains the essential content of the source, is also frequent, but not necessarily as problematic because they're not directly lifting all words in the paper. They also found that the remix and recycle forms of plagiarism were very frequent. The remix is where someone paraphrases from other sources and makes the content fit seamlessly. And the recycle is where one borrows generously from one's own previous work without citing it. And then there's the hybrid, which is where a person combines perfectly cited sources with copied passages without citation in one paper. And then finally, they review the mashup, which is also fairly frequent, which contains a mix of copied material from several different sources without citation. The 404 error, which is not as frequent, which is where a written piece includes citations to non-existent or inaccurate information about the sources. Or the aggregator, which includes proper citations but almost no original work in a paper. And I've seen this where students just copy and put different things in from other sources and they really don't put any of their own words in there at all. And then there's the retweet, which includes proper citation, but too closely relies on the original wording and structure of a paper. So you have to remember that plagiarism is not only the original words, but also how an original paper is laid out. For example, if you're writing a review paper and the paragraph order and context that is written is exactly the same as yours, that can be considered plagiarism. More often, we find students have issues with accidental plagiarism, but it is where someone would paraphrase the words of others, but use words that are too similar. And instead, they should probably quote the original source. Another example is where someone is building on someone else's ideas, but not citing the original work. So in general, guidelines for what needs cited include any words from a book, journal, paper, web page, or TV show. I generally use the guideline that if there are 3 or more words strung together that appear in a source that you have used, you should cite that. Exact words or unique phrase are copied. These things should be cited as well, such as a definition of a disease state. That's probably where that would come up. Any tables or images that are reproduced in your paper from a different source should be cited, as well as personal communication. So if there's a researcher that you've worked with who has told you that, certain subjects are at increased risk of a disease and you don't find that cited, but it's based on their own work, you could say that it's cited based on personal communication with that individual because it's not been published yet. Things that generally don't need to be cited are things that come from your own words or your own experiences, your own results of research, or common knowledge for generally accepted facts. And these would be things that you can find also undocumented in at least 5 or more sources. Some tips for you on how to avoid plagiarism. When you're taking notes, if you take handwritten notes, make sure you specify in those notes what came from other sources versus what came from your own thoughts. You can also do this electronically or in pen when you write by color coding sections of your writing. In red, I usually put what comes directly from other sources. I might do this in my outline where I'm thinking of what papers am I going to cite, what information was important from those papers, and I might copy and paste certain elements of those papers in red and then ultimately change them or incorporate them into larger paragraphs in my paper. In blue, I usually color code what's written in my own words but would need revised. And then black would be the revised and final version of the sections of your paper that are fully referenced. Here are some additional tips on how to avoid plagiarism, and this is the method that I typically follow when writing a review paper. First, I read all the papers that I will use as a background at once. I will then set them aside and come back later to actually write my paper. I will write what I want to say and then go back and find papers to support my general statements. I'll then step away and come back later and revise that paper with a critical eye, and then give my paper to a colleague to read and suggest revisions. Then I will revise it accordingly with a critical eye based on the revisions, as well as, reading it through for a third time. And then I will also typically submit it to turn it in. And as part of the course in the research project, we will submit your backgrounds and your protocols to turn it in to compare it to other published work. We will try to let you have access to that report through Blackboard, where you'll be able to see how close your paper is to other published papers, especially if there seems to be a problem. Other examples for quotations, you should use these only when absolutely necessary. Keep them as short as possible and set them apart from other text in quotation marks. And in terms of best practices, you should name and date every draft of your paper so you don't mix up versions where you had things not cited properly and unintentionally turn that in or publish that information. You should back up your work regularly, as well as password protect your computer. I hope you find these tips helpful, and we will work to help you as advisors try to avoid plagiarism in your research background and throughout your research project. Thanks a lot for listening.